My name's Robert Dayton Castleman, and I'm here to talk to you about a project that I did 2 years ago. But it really begins as a little boy. When I was a boy, I was capable of weaving any structure, any article of clothing, any vehicle into one of my elaborate astronaut fantasies. I wanted to be an astronaut. One such car ride I remember taking with great anticipation. We were to see a shuttle launch at school that day, so my shuttle mission to school with Mom was full of excitement. It was 1986. I was in 5th grade and I was 10 years old. The elementary school at St. Paul First English Lutheran School piled into the cafeteria that day, and on a boxy little color television on a cart at one end of the room, we watched images of the space shuttle. It was all done with great anticipation. Of course, finally it came to that most exciting point, the point of no return, and the countdown: 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off. At that time in my life, it was magical. There was a teacher on that space shuttle, just like my teachers. I so wish that I was on that plane as it soared into the sky. 72 seconds later, we all watched the Space Shuttle Challenger dissolve into a billowing white cloud. It was amorphous. It didn't reflect the geometry of space travel. There were plumes of smoke shooting off in a variety of different directions. As the reality of it sunk into the students and sunk into the teachers, and as commentators began to talk about what was going on, a somber mood settled on that cafeteria, and we all went back to our classrooms uncharacteristically subdued after an event like that. About 30 minutes later, my teacher told me that there was someone waiting for me out in the hallway, and I went out there, and it was my mom. She knew that I wanted to be an astronaut, and she was concerned with how I was doing in the face of this really horrible thing to witness for a young kid. She asked me how I was doing, and I said, "I'm okay, Mama. I still want to be an astronaut." And those words became particularly important for me another 30 years later, and that's the story that I'm going to tell you about today. That story began on April 24th of 2015. A doctor walked into a hospital room that I found myself in, and he told me, "You have a brain tumor. It's a 9mm colloid cyst." I was familiar with the colloid cyst because I'd had one before. It was in 2001, and the image on the screen is a CAT scan of that particular cyst. Discovering that cyst and having brain surgery to remove it happened over the course of a weekend. Now I was faced with something very different. This little 9mm ball, about the size of a Cheerio, that had only two possible outcomes. One was that it would blow up in my brain and kill me, or two is that it would be surgically removed. Neither of those options sounded very interesting to me, and I descended into a type of malaise, really overwhelmed and overcome with fear during that time. I spent days in solitude oftentimes. I needed the time to process. One of the things I did in the picture that you see on the left was roll little 9mm balls of clay, just to try to wrap my head around how something so small could potentially derail my life. I had not grown up to be an artist, I'd not grown up to be an astronaut, but an artist. I'd also grown up and gotten married and had 3 kids, and there was a lot on the line, a lot of fear. It reminded me of the same type of brooding fear as the Cold War, where there was this constant buzz in the background that if just the wrong things happened politically, we could annihilate one another in a giant conflagration. The anniversary of the Challenger explosion on January 28th of 2016 was an important change and moment within that journey of anticipating brain surgery, however. I recalled those words that I'd said to my mom 30 years prior: "I still want to be an astronaut," and I contributed those words to the social media conversation about that particular anniversary. as I was typing the words, it began to occur to me that what I really longed for was the courage that that little boy had in the face of the tragedy of the Challenger explosion. I wished that I could tap into that in some way. And I decided really at that moment, why not be an astronaut? Why not allow that same type of make-believe world that I created for myself as a child guide me through this very frightening process? And so I began to construct all of the required elements of a great astronaut fantasy. For one was needing a building. In the image on the left, you'll see a photograph that I took as a little boy of the Michoud Vehicle Assembly Plant, about 5 miles from my home in New Orleans growing up. This is where they built the external fuel tank for the space shuttle. It was important to me, and I think the photograph attests to that, because it was a giant building with NASA plastered on the side of it. And that's really all it required to be a part of my fantasy. A bedroom could be mission control. A cardboard box could be something. The Washington Regional Medical Center became my space center. This would be the point of my launch. This would be where I took off from. This would be the site of my selection testing. My mind was filled with imagery of that 1983 film, The Right Stuff, where you have these Mercury astronauts vying to be the first men from the United States in outer space. And those were the images that were going through my head. An important one of those sequence in that film was the selection testing scenes, where they're putting these men through all of these physical trials in order to determine who would be the ones selected to be an astronaut. At this point, since I was an astronaut and not a brain surgery recipient, I was going into my CAT scans and my MRIs with that same mindset. In fact, this gown that you're looking at was what I wore for the first MRI. They stick you into a very tight tube. They blast the devil's experimental music into your head. It's so loud and it's so claustrophobic and it's horrible. But I was John Glenn. I was in that tube, calming my breathing, seeing myself through it. Another important part of any astronaut fantasy, of course, is clothing. In the image you see on the right, you'll see me as a young boy at Cape Canaveral sticking my head into a spacesuit. My new spacesuit would contrast significantly with that spacesuit that I was wearing as a little boy. Those spacesuits are intended to insulate you from the outside world. They're intended to create a miniature environment within which you are protected from what's on the outside. These kinds of spacesuits are designed to make you as accessible as possible. There's a far greater degree of intimacy, but this was the suit that I would wear on my journey as I blasted off. I used the suit for a series of photographs. This photograph is titled Mercury. Of course, it takes its name from the Roman god Mercury, from which the first manned space mission of the United States took its name. I believe that their name was aspirational in naming it that. I was more interested in Mercury being the bridge between the overworld and the underworld, the ones that would ferry human beings from life to death when they died. I selected a stump to stand on and to be out in nature completely exposed. I'm not wearing anything under that outfit. The spacesuit also found its way into drawings where I was creating meditative works in order to process what it was that I was going to go through. There was this interesting correspondence between being lifted up as if drawn away from the earth bodily in death, but also this sense of weightlessness, that sense of floating and not knowing exactly which way is up or down or left or right. Of course, a significant part of any really good space fantasy centers around the vehicles. I'm quite certain that these two photographs were ones that I told my mom, hey mom, take a picture of me in front of the spaceships. Take a picture of me in front of the space shuttle. There was an identification with that. And my own exploration of the space vehicle was one that was a bit more personal and meditative. I began to recognize the correspondences between the vessel, which in the case of my own journey was my own body, and these spacecraft, which were used as the vessels for an astronaut's journey. My mummification of these, wrapping them up in my own old white t-shirts cut up into strips, was an important part of it. And it was interesting to recognize that when I finished, these are the Mercury Redstone rocket through the Atlas V rocket, the rocket that took Alan Shepard up into low Earth orbit for one moment, and the rocket that put men on the moon. The difference in scale is pretty dramatic. They also resembled hand-dipped candles, if you've ever seen one of those, and I like this idea of impermanence. Once you light that fuse, once you light that wick, it's going to burn down. Again, another metaphor for mortality that snuck its way into the work. After that first surgery I mentioned, I was also making objects that were related to it, all kind of preoccupied with the sudden imminence of death. In this case, a mummified form inside of a sort of sarcophagus. But I utilized that same wrapping and covering in wax in order to work on that particular imagery. This work is titled Gemini, another vessel, another meditative one. Gemini was important for me because it was the first time that a person went into outer space with company. A lot of this journey I was experiencing alone, but I was heavily supported by people that surrounded me. The heat tiles on the bottom of that sculpture that you see there, that I don't have a photograph of, are the prayers written on slips of paper by members of my church that cut up into little squares to create that protective shield, so to speak. Of course, the hot rod flames were because at this point, it's about a week away from going into brain surgery, and I was pretty much trying to put my head down and endure the whole thing. They weren't only objects or personal rituals that were taking place. I was also trying to create a way to tell my friends and loved ones and have an opportunity for them to support me. Dayton's Big Haircut was one such happening. I learned from my first surgery that when you go in for brain surgery, they don't just shave your whole head. They just shave the part that they need to use. You get out from brain surgery and you've got a terrible headache and you're in pretty bad shape and you've got a half of a head of hair that you have to deal with somehow. I decided that my bare head would be the helmet that I would wear into this experience, and I would walk into Washington Regional Space Center with my helmet on, ready to go, that nobody can mess up. Here's an image. It was a celebratory occasion as much as anything else. We had beer, there was great conversation, and my good friend Alan, a hairdresser, shaved my head to the bone. Again, the mortal metaphors snuck into here. It felt both like being baptized or commissioned for something important I was about to do and being sheared for the slaughter. Both of these things were happening simultaneously, and it was a very moving time, but again, centered on that space helmet. I used the hair from that experience, from cutting off, to draw the flames on the side of that Gemini capsule. In one sense, lighting my hair on fire as I dove into the mouth of the wolf, so to speak. The operating room is the least difficult part of having a space fantasy when it comes to brain surgery. You walk into this really sci-fi setting. It looks a little bit more like an alien abduction fantasy than an astronaut fantasy, but it was a very important part of it. Of course, it's in that room that the anesthesiologist really proceeds over everything. You get prepared, they put a needle in your arm, and he says, count down from 10. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then there's a void. You go away, but it is that decisive moment, the moment that you pass out of consciousness and hope to come back into consciousness at some point in the future. In the meantime, there's a human being with his actual hands on and in your brain. All of those fears sort of coalesce into that moment of the void. And you experience nothing. And then you open your eyes and you recognize a face in front of you. You see a loved one and they have a name that you can recall. that you can remember. And there's a joy that floods over you at the same time that your body is racked with pain in a variety of different ways. I noted, of course, the headache that I had, which is not surprising after having brain surgery, but it also led me to one of the two most important takeaways from this experience. One of those is that this is the greatest cup of coffee that was ever brewed in the history of humankind. Because caffeine withdrawal headaches mixed with brain surgery headaches do not feel very good at all. That cup of Arcega's coffee saved my life and was as good as any of the exotic drugs that I was on at the time. I really appreciated that particular cup of coffee. But I think the main takeaway from it, the passing through this elaborate astronaut fantasy in order to help me grapple with the fear, really boiled down to the fact that the purpose of this mission, while I hope to go to outer space and leave this payload up there, my real goal was returning back to Earth. That being an astronaut in this case was really all about being an Earthling and hoping to return to being an Earthling, to see my loved ones again, of course, to get the big thumbs up, mission accomplished for my kids and my wife. Thank you very much for listening. Have a good one.